Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. This episode continues our investigation into the potential wide-ranging implications of advanced AI for economics. Traditionally, value is said to be created by a combination of capital, which covers the cost of materials and equipment, and labour, whereby humans exercise skills, ingenuity, diligence, attention, and more. What has been a constant debate is the appropriate division of rewards between capital and labour. Critics of the operation of capitalism have often predicted that an accumulation of value within small groups of owners of capital will cause economic instabilities and a subsequent collapse. Despite these forecasts, capitalism has, so far, demonstrated great resilience, defying predictions of its collapse. But if human labour is increasingly displaced by advanced automation, the balance of labour and capital will be fundamentally changed, and capitalism will come under unprecedented pressures. That's the thesis of our guest today, Ted Shelton. I first met Ted about 25 years ago when he was Chief Strategy Officer of the software development tools company Borland, and I was an executive within the early smartphone industry. Since that time, Ted has worked for a variety of companies in and around Silicon Valley, including PwC, Cognizant Technology Solutions, Catalytic, Bain, and Inflection AI. Recently, he has been giving a great deal of thought to where AI is taking the economy. Ted, welcome to the London Futurists podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, David.
Thank you for joining us, Ted.
Ted, how did you evolve from the Chief Strategy Officer of a software tools company to a researcher in economics?
Well, I have to say that it certainly wasn't a plan. It was definitely more accidental. You've looked, obviously, at all the things I've done since we first met, David. But if you think about the kind of role that one plays when one's advising enterprises, you're helping organizations figure out how to compete, how to grow, how to allocate resources, all effectively applied economics, even if it's called strategy. The language that you use is not the traditional language of the economist, because that's really not in the business school educational program. You have a very different linguistic structure, but actually you're thinking about all of these core economic issues. And so even while I was Chief Strategy Officer at Borland, we were already thinking about impacts of automation and offshoring on the structure of organizations. And the evolution led me back to looking at some of the core economic theories. Thomas Piketty's book about 21st century capital was certainly one influence, but then that actually caused me to go back to read Marx and a whole set of thinkers that have been thinking specifically about AI in a post-Marx world from a variety of perspectives. And so I said, I have to embed myself in this academic understanding and put some real intellectual rigor behind the things that I'm right in the middle of and seeing.
These writers often predicted the failure of capitalism. Marx, I'm sure, would be surprised that capitalism is still thriving 140 years after his death or so. So what's different about the scenarios that you've got in mind for how AI will change things?
One note on Marx, I do think there's an important separation between his political beliefs and agenda, which is how he's primarily remembered because of all of the things that have been done in his name since then, versus his early work in really just understanding the function of capitalism, which is what I was most interested in, because I thought going back to the 1800s, at the very early stages of the Industrial Revolution, to understand what people were really seeing on the ground. I also went back and read Wealth of Nations, which I think is also tremendously amazing work. 1776, the same year as the American Revolution, not to bring up a sore point with you as my British friends.
We forgive you. Some of the things you've done since, not so sure about, but we forgive you for 1776.
It's been up and down, but we have a special relationship, I understand. But anyway, you go back and you look at these writers who were writing right at the beginning of something that was happening, and there's a clarity of thought and yet a lack of perspective on where it's going. That is fascinating. And that's sort of where I found myself as well. So part of the inspiration of going back to Das Kapital and to Wealth of Nations was to say, what is it possible for someone as a thinker to understand at the moment when something is first happening? And how can you communicate that clarity of understanding in a very future-proof way despite the fact that you really don't know where it's going. And the lesson in both cases is that you have to break it down to sort of the core components of the underlying primitives, if you will, for what's happening in the system, because those are going to be the enduring legacy that others later, when the shape of things becomes more clear, can build on. That's a long prelude to the answer to your question about what happened with capitalism. But I think the thing that was unclear to Marx and to other thinkers is the ways in which capitalism could be resilient to all of the mechanisms that they predicted would cause it to collapse. It absorbed the labor movement, the welfare state, Keynesian demand management, and each time gave participants in the economy, the laborer, a way to continue to participate. In my mind, actually, the really interesting mechanism here is democratic governance. Obviously, a bunch of different systems have been tried: fascism, communism, top-down command and control. But the balance has been capital, labor, and government, because ultimately capital does need labor, but labor needs a focused voice to be able to stand up against capital, and so government becomes that voice. So I think we can attribute a lot of the mechanism of success to that triumvirate. And that's actually part of what concerns me today, that as the role of labor declines as a total part of the economy, the role of government will shift. And the ability for government to really be that intermediary to manage the interaction between capital and labor, the role of government may shift. And you may see, I think we are seeing more control being exerted by capital over government and impacting how government then thinks of its role in that interaction between labor and capital.
Is it really the case that labor is declining? You said that it's interesting when you notice when something is first happening, but many people will point to quite high levels of employment despite AI changing jobs.
I'm not going to recall the first person, I think he was British though, so you may recall. Lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Disraeli, probably. Benjamin Disraeli.
Disraeli, yeah, probably. That sounds like a likely candidate. So I think we have been done a great disservice by government in reporting unemployment statistics. In the United States, under President Clinton, we entirely revised the way in which we report unemployment statistics. I'm unhappy to say that as a result of our very special relationship, I think Clinton and his administration were informed by Margaret Thatcher, who started doing the same thing in the UK in the 1980s and actually changed the definition of unemployment 30 times during her reign of power. So what if I were to tell you that rather than the official statistics that you see of unemployment in the UK being about 4%, what if I were to tell you that the actual rate of unemployment is closer to 20%? And would that explain some of the politics that are going on right now and the sense of disenfranchisement, especially in Northern England? One specific example, miners. Rather than going on to the unemployment rolls when the mines were shut down, they were put onto sick benefits and excluded from the class of people that were counted in the employment rolls altogether. There are a number of thinkers who've gone back both in the US and the UK and looked at what would a real comparative unemployment rate today look like if we were to use the same mechanisms to count unemployment that were used in your case, the early 1980s, in our case, the early 1990s. So it is showing up. We also probably have roughly structurally 20% unemployment in the US, which is now getting close to Great Depression level unemployment.
Yeah, because in the Great Depression, the peak was 25%, but of course they didn't have any kind of welfare state, so it was absolutely devastating in a way that even 20% isn't today. I just popped down to the Bodleian Library and checked out on that quote. Mark Twain attributed it to Disraeli, so top points, David, but apparently Mark Twain was wrong. It didn't come from Disraeli, and there's some lesser unknown people who used it fairly soon after, so the real answer is nobody knows where that quote came from.
I'm glad I didn't remember then.
Ted, in your paper, I give you very high marks for taking seriously, as I understand your paper, the view that it's likely that there will be massive, if not total, unemployment at some point in the not terribly distant future. But I wanted to just clarify that because I wasn't entirely clear. Are you expecting full automation to mean there's pretty much no jobs for humans? There may be a few at governance levels, but for 90%, 99% of humans, no jobs. Or do you think there'll be a halfway house with some humans still doing kind of artisanal things or performance service jobs because rich people like the idea of being served by a human rather than a robot? So is the level of automation you're expecting kind of 95% plus or 70% or something like that?
I don't like the framing. So I'm going to do the classic thing that one does when one's being interviewed, but I'm making it transparent. I'm going to change the question because I think a more interesting question to ask is what happens to the nature of what we think of as employment today, over what time period, and what does employment look like in the future? Because I think if you were to remain in the frame that you start with, which is to say, look, I have a job today, I'm a janitor and I pick up trash in the tube stations. And you were to say, well, is that job going to exist once I have robots that can roam up and down the tube stations and pick up all the trash? The answer would be no. Clearly, it will be much better to have robots picking up all the trash in all the stations. And so I'm going to eliminate that trash pickup job. And that is going to be extremely disruptive to janitors. Pick your category. But I'll stick with the particular example because I think it's interesting to talk about the particulars. What is going to happen when I have a fleet of robots across the entire Transport for London system that are responsible for trash pickup? Well, I'm going to have people that are deploying those robots, managing the robots, figuring out what to do when the robot falls off the platform. Stop the trains. There's a robot in the way. I am going to need people in roles related to robot management, robot maintenance, robot operations, and they are very different roles. And so how does the janitor become the robot maintenance worker? I think this disruption is actually the thing that I worry about the most, as opposed to simply saying, oh, well, unemployment's X now and it's going to go to Y later. I worry about the jobs that we have today are not going to be the jobs that we have tomorrow, and we don't have mechanisms in place to think about that.
That's really interesting because I don't think you have swerved my question. You may not have liked the framing, but I think you've answered my question because you've said there will still be quite a lot of jobs. They'll be different from the jobs people are doing today, but there'll be still a lot of jobs for humans. And for what it's worth, I disagree with that. I think the job of identifying that a robot fell onto the tracks and needs to be got off the tracks, I think that can be done by a robot. I think the job of deciding where you deploy all the robots, that can be done by an AI. That's a reasonable difference of opinion that reasonable people can have.
Actually, I'm not disagreeing with you. I think it's a question of time period. I think there's going to be phases of deployment where, yes, there is some point in the future, I don't know how long in the future, when even that task of managing the robot fleet will be done by a robot. I would anchor in three things, though, that I think that human beings will continue to do fairly far into the future. And by the way, happy to diverge into a discussion of Ray Kurzweil and the notion of a future in which humans and machines merge. We can do that maybe at the end. But again, that's a question of time frame. How do we move forward? The problem is that the disruptions that are going to happen at each phase are going to be very destabilizing for the society as they redefine what it is to work. And I think actually a more important question for us to ask is, how do we as a society decide to structure that evolutionary path? And what do we interject into that path to make it easier for people to navigate as things fundamentally change all the way between now and when we are merged with machines? But let me anchor you on three things. One is fiduciary responsibility cannot be held by a machine, at least in all the legal structures we have today and in anything comprehensible to us today. What would it mean to hold a machine fiduciarily responsibility, or legally, or from a capital punishment perspective? You've killed a person, so what are you going to do? Turn you off? Delete your source code? Human beings still need to be in the seat of having the accountability for what is done. And for human beings to be in that accountability seat, they also need to comprehend and be able to direct what is being done. And so I think there's a really important role for humans. I don't think we're training people to do it right now. I don't think we've defined these roles well, but I think it's going to be a very important ongoing role for humans to have the accountability for what machines do.
Yeah.
Number two is what I will call creativity. And we can get into a long debate about what creativity means. But ultimately, while the machines are terrific paintbrushes, we still have to direct the paintbrush. And the way in which we direct that paintbrush is we have experiences in the world. Those experiences have meaning because they're constituted in the set of other experiences that we have. We choose to express our feelings, our emotions, our thoughts in a particular way. We may use the paintbrush of AI to be the way to manifest that expression in the world. But I still think we're going to have human beings that drive that creativity. And you can also constitute creativity as, hey, I want to go and explore this place. I want to go and discover in this domain. I want to solve this problem. We're going to direct. We're going to have the agency. And again, it's maybe a matter of time. So we don't have any visibility into machines that have agency. Humans have agency. Humans want things to happen, and they're going to drive those things to happen. And then the third is interpersonal relationships. I hope the next time I come to London, I can meet you in person. We'll have a lovely dinner or a pint of beer or whatever it happens to be. But the relationship that you and I have is very different from the relationship you'll ever have with a machine, not to take away from how individuals may, in fact, gain some solace from consulting with a machine on the problems they have. But when I talk about raising my kids, I'm relating to you a real lived experience that's fundamentally different than what a machine can ever do. And all the roles you think of, coaching or selling or anything that involves an interpersonal relationship is still going to be a role that we're going to want people in. I think that we will redefine these things, but you need to think about timescale.
Will there be enough roles there to keep most citizens gainfully employed? Because I can see there's some role for fiduciary responsibility, but I don't imagine that everybody's going to have some fiduciary responsibility. I'm less convinced about creativity. I'm on the fence about interpersonal relationships, to what extent people will be paid for a personal relationship. Do you see this as leaving roughly the same number of people involved in labour, or will it be many fewer people?
So here's the problem. The problem is that the way in which you're framing your questions depends upon a system, which my paper and my thinking leads me to believe is actually going to be fundamentally changed. This is exactly why I went back to Wealth of Nations and Das Kapital to try to understand how, if you're in the middle of this, it's 1776 or 1865, how do you ground a set of thinking in what's happening in the world that you can see and touch right now? Because if you start with, gee, are things going to look a lot like they are today and people are going to have the same sort of relationship to the economy that they have today? I think the answer is clearly no. Does that mean that we're going to be idle and not engage in any sort of activity? I think that answer is no as well. And so you need to actually, I think, take a step back and say, what are the underlying primitives here? The primitives are, I expect that there is a set of production activities that are entirely taken over by machines, but I expect that people will still have activities that they engage in. And I expect that we will evolve the economy in such a way that the people who are engaged in activities will be able to connect with the productive output in a way that allows them to sustain their lives and get everything they need, if not more of what they want. How do we then, as a society, allocate? Because there still will be scarcity. We may have abundance in being able to fulfill everyone's needs. We'll always have scarcity in fulfilling everybody's wants. And so how do we allocate against people's wants? That mechanism is undiscovered.
At the moment, to be very simplistic, the great majority of humans, the overwhelming majority of humans, receive the resources that they need to stay alive and to live whatever degree of good life they lead through doing a job. And one hypothesis, which I had thought you agreed with, this is what I'm trying to bottom out, is that that's going to change, that doing a job will not be possible in the sense that you won't be able to be paid for pretty much any activity. You might be paid for holding some residual level of accountability. You might be paid for showing some residual level of creativity, though I share with David skepticism about whether that is totally defensible. You might even be paid for providing some sort of relationship benefit. But I think those jobs are going to be a tiny, tiny minority. And so we're going to move to a world in this hypothesis in which doing a job is not how you get the resources that you need to stay alive. You need to get those resources in another way. And I'm still not quite clear whether you agree with that.
I do agree with that.
Okay, great.
I do agree with that. That's why I was trying to parse out these primitives. I think it would be wrong to say that there will be no activity. I think it'll be wrong to say that there'll be no mechanism for the allocation of scarce resources. hopefully we are in agreement that the logical path is toward abundance to fulfill everyone's needs, but that there will always be wants that go beyond any sort of definition of abundance. I want to go to Mars. Actually, I don't. I let Elon do that. Not anybody who just stands up and says, hey, I want to go to Mars today is going to be allowed to go to Mars today. So you're going to have some allocation against people's wants. And so we are going to need a mechanism. My point in the paper and in my thinking is that capitalism fundamentally breaks for exactly the reasons that Marx explains for how capitalism does work. Capitalism is an exchange, a participation in the economy by labor in respect to labor's contribution back to that economy, so that the allocation of scarcity is actually done according to the contribution that labor makes against the economy. If you then propose that labor is going to have a diminishing contribution to the economy, then labor is going to participate in a diminishing way and it's going to break. So you're going to have a different mechanism. This is why I think we actually need to change the conversation from employment to a conversation about ownership.
Or actually a conversation about distribution, because ownership can be pretty close to irrelevant. There's very few people in this world who have much wealth. The great majority of people live hand to mouth. That kind of works. It's unsatisfactory in all sorts of ways, but it kind of works. And we're going to move to a society where the current way of receiving current resources is not going to work anymore. It seems to me that the overwhelmingly important question is how we get that distribution to work, how we set up a system of distribution from those probably very small number of people who own all the productive assets in this new world to everybody else. What terrifies me is that there's virtually no thinking about that going on at all. If the current mechanism of doing a job is not how most people will get resources in the future, how do you think that the distribution could happen in the future? By hypothesis, Sam Altman, Dario Amodei, and Demis Hassabis own the world economy. They've appropriated the world economy because everything can be done by an LLM or an easily derived software based on an LLM. And there is no income achievable by people in Somalia or Italy or Britain or Alabama. And those three people, plus a few others who own stuff, have to distribute resources to everybody else. That's a major distribution problem. That seems to me to be the problem we should all be addressing.
I think the problem of framing it as distribution is similar to the problem of framing it as employment, which is that you are starting from a conjecture that the economy functions in the way that it functions today, and you've already then taken it to its logical endpoint of three people own the entire economy. Well, we're not going to get there. There's no way that 8 billion people are going to allow three people to own the entire economy. And that's why I say we need to reframe it from a conversation about employment to a conversation about ownership. Let me do a similar thought exercise to the one that you just did in terms of taking things to their logical extreme. So now let's imagine that we've improved AI systems such that they are, and perhaps you've heard this language of recursive self-improvement, so that they are recursively self-improving themselves. And so all of the amazing AI engineers that work currently for those three people are irrelevant because the machine is able to improve itself so much faster than any of those individuals can come up with any improvement. If you go back to Richard Sutton's bitter lesson essay, just apply more compute and the compute will solve itself. So who owns compute that solves itself? Does the compute own compute that solves itself? Why are we as a society saying that a set of people that allocated capital at a particular moment to capture intellectual property, and by the way, not just books and movies and images and all that, but also the core algorithmic research over 70 years funded by governments and public universities, they've captured all this intellectual property, put capital behind it, and so now forever they own the entire economy?
I'm not terribly bothered about whether we say Sam Altman and the others own all the productive resources. Your enclosure argument in your paper is quite interesting. You draw a parallel between the enclosure of productive land in late medieval world to what's gone on by people appropriating what was essentially common intellectual property embedded in LLMs. I'm not persuaded by that argument, but it's interesting. I'm not terribly worried about actually who ends up owning stuff at the end. What does interest me is what is the distribution mechanism for getting resources to 8 billion people from the small number of software model developing companies, regardless who owns them. They might be nationalized, they might be an oligarchy which is heavily regulated. It doesn't really matter. The distribution of assets, resources, not ownership, but resources, from that small group to 8 billion people, that's the critical problem, surely.
We're right at the intellectual cusp of the problem here, because you want this to be about distribution, because that is individuals' lives, ultimately the thing that is going to mean whether they have a good life or not a good life. But distribution, if you back into that problem, is about how do you take from some to give to more, which ultimately then is a question of ownership. It is a question of saying, how much should we allow Sam to retain? And by the way, as a side point, Sam owns 0 of OpenAI, which is another whole interesting dynamic here.
Yeah.
So let's pick on Elon Musk instead. Elon Musk, world's first trillionaire, reason enough to point to him. Do we want him to be worth 10 trillion, 100 trillion, a quadrillion? I think that is the societal question to ask. I'm not saying that Elon Musk shouldn't do well. He can go to Mars if he wants. He's done an enormous amount. Whether you agree with his politics or not, I think the transformation of the auto industry, we have to give him some credit for that.
Totally. Musk 1.0 was a hero.
So we could imagine an economic system in which the economic system rewarded contributions such that Musk is permitted by the economic system to have more of his wants filled than you or I have our wants filled, because he has demonstrably and measurably contributed something greater than you and I have contributed. So that's what I'm asking for. I'm asking for a restatement. It does ultimately get to the distribution point, because distribution ends up being, what is the mechanism by which we differentially provide individuals with what they want, not just what they need? The new economic model is necessary post-capitalism.
So can I ask you to spell out some elements of this post-capitalism that you have in mind?
We'll be right back after a quick break.
Imagine being in the boardroom with the world's most influential C-suite executives, exploring big questions about the economy, AI, and hybrid work. Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, hosted by Steve Odland, President and CEO of the Conference Board, the ultimate podcast for professionals seeking the truth beyond trending headlines. Cut through the noise and dive into data-driven discussions, unbiased, nonpartisan, and straight from the top. Listen to C-Suite Perspectives and harness the power of trusted insights for what's ahead.
This is the part that gets really, really hard. And this is, again, why I went back to Wealth of Nations and Das Kapital, because what I wanted to try to understand is, what can you say that is grounded about today versus what then leads you into a speculative position of stating your wishes or desires rather than saying, okay, this is logically or mathematically the outcome. So first of all, let me start with great society means that we should be all working on a global basis to make sure that the 8 billion inhabitants of our planet all do really have everything that fulfills their needs. That alone is an enormous distribution problem. Go back to your distribution comment. We actually probably produce enough food today. I've seen lots of statistics on this. We probably produce enough food today. There's no one that should be hungry, and yet we don't do a good job of distributing the food. And why don't we? Well, mostly there are problems with human intermediaries who wish to have more of their wants served than making sure that all of their citizens' needs are served. A lot of intermediaries in the distribution channel. So we have to solve that problem first. How does that happen? I think that has to happen through government collaboration around the world. And that obviously is extraordinarily difficult. So it probably doesn't start there. It probably ends there. I think where we have to actually start is actually at the other end of the economic ladder, where we have to start saying, how is it that the people who are actually capable of making change in the world are going to live in a world in which their needs are satisfied and their wants are satisfied to the extent that their contributions are recognized? That becomes the really hard mechanism problem. Capitalism is a super efficient way of doing it, not just because we have this mechanism called money that we move around in order to sort of keep score on who's made a contribution, but also because it has the political efficacy of all of the participants in the system accepting the inequality of the outcomes. And maybe you have more of those points, dollars, pounds, because you inherited them, you were born into the right family. Maybe you have them because you won the lottery. Maybe you have them because you have a special skill that was valued by the economy, whatever it happens to be. But we all sort of accept the inequality. Again, going back to primitives, to construct a new system, we have to actually start with that question of how will the inequalities be meted out in a way that is politically acceptable, not just to the poor who would love to have more, but also to the rich who are going to have less.
Yeah. Ted, it seems to me that in your paper, you do a great job of facing square on the problem that we're going to have to change the economic system because you might not like this framing, but because the way that currently 8 billion people get the resources they need, not just to have a good life, but to stay alive, that's going to change. That nexus is going to break. And at various points during your paper, you refer to what some of the solutions might be. There's one bit in section 10, you talk about 4 ways the broken wage consumption circuit might be patched: transfers, public provisioning, access licensing, and debt finance consumption. And I was hoping that you would have gone into more detail on that. In a way, I think I should be panting in eagerness for your sequel to this paper, because I think you asked the very, very important question in the final paragraph. And you say it very well. You say the decisive question of the post-labor age is not whether society can produce enough. The decisive question is on what terms access to that productive capacity will be organized. And you say another few things. But that seems to me the important question. And so I suppose my question to you is, are you going to write a sequel in which you answer that question?
Well, yes. I guess the purpose of writing the paper is to have a conversation like the one we're having here, to try to engage more people who have different roles in our society, whether they're academics or they're politicians or they're business people, to all engage in this set of questions that I think are pressing. I don't think this is a hypothetical 100 years out. Wealth of Nations described a world that was changing right at that moment, in the UK first. And it affected people's lives in meaningful ways. And this is as well. And without a real policy conversation, we can't begin to ameliorate those changes. My point in the first paper was to survey, and that list of 4 possibilities is not my list of 4 possibilities. These are the 4 possibilities that are commonly being discussed amongst people who actually are having this conversation today. But the intent of this first paper was really just to say, look, here's everything we know about this issue. Here's a way to break it down into some interesting component parts so we understand it all. We all have a common vocabulary. We agree on what the problem is. We now don't agree on what the solution is, but I pointed the direction toward taking those next exploratory steps to try to start understanding the solution.
Do you have any feeling for whether politicians in China will be more receptive to these arguments, or are they equally far behind on the learning curve?
I think China is much more likely to view the AI component of production as infrastructure, which I think is one of the more interesting avenues to explore. So if I come back to my taking things to some future endpoint, and we have computers that simply improve computers, that becomes a core infrastructure for the civilization. The Chinese system, we have to give credit in the regard that they have experimented with a hybrid of capitalism and a command and control economy. And if they can continue to manage which parts of their system utilize capitalism effectively and which parts of their system utilize command and control effectively, there are certain advantages over the West, and we can see it in the economic growth that they've been able to achieve. Now, obviously, there's a challenge for us in the West and other aspects of that, where some of the aspects of the command and control approach impact how we live our lives and what things we're allowed to say and who we're allowed to interact with and which populations are acceptable populations versus unacceptable populations. I'm not on board with all that. I think that's a fair thing from where I sit in the West to say. So I wouldn't want to accept the good and the bad of that system, But I do think that the notion that AI becomes infrastructure is actually really compelling and that they're in a better position to adopt that position.
I think that's right. We have a hybrid economy. We don't have a pure capitalist economy, not by a very long shot. The state in most of Europe spends about 40% of GDP. So we're a hybrid between capitalism and a welfare state. China's a hybrid between capitalism, a welfare state, and a command and control state. And they might find it much easier to deal with the ideological change from a world where jobs are how most humans receive the resources they need to live to a world where that isn't the case. And the state doles it out. It might be much, much easier for them to make that shift. Or it might be much easier for them to take the time and put the resources into designing ways that that shift could happen. That's the really important thing. So who knows? Maybe the future of capitalism will be solved by China.
What I love about where we are at in human history is that we have a world in which there are many parallel experiments that are being done about how to organize human beings and organize productivity. And so you have one extreme. I was going to say the United States might be one extreme, but actually I'll go even further and say you have an extreme of the sovereign nations of the Middle East, with another whole completely different way of approaching the balance between government, capital, and labor. You have the United States, you have Europe, you have different parts of Asia, including China. I think we need to learn from all of them, because I do genuinely believe that the way in which we organize humans and productivity in a future in which tokens are a critical, if not the critical component of productivity, has to look different than the system of capitalism, which has grown up over the last 300 years.
My last question would be to look at another analysis of what's going on. That is the techno-feudalism analysis of the former Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis. He's basically saying we've got to give up our ideas on how capitalism works. We're now seeing much more money paid for rent or ownership. Is that an analysis you agree with? Do you think there's any insight to be had from that? Or would you start from a different point?
I think you can see from my paper that there are a lot of places where there's a natural alliance in his thinking to where I've described the evolution of the economy as well. I would highlight that I think feudalism is an unfortunate term to bring into the conversation. The analogy to feudalism is problematic in that feudalism existed in part because of local fragmentation, the weak states, and the general economic stagnation during the Middle Ages. It was much more of a system that existed in order to manage extreme scarcity, as opposed to a system with all of what we see happening in the world. We can hope reasonably for a system that is actually going to manage abundance. I think there is a great divergence there. But the notion that we have a problem in control of the compute stack in a small number of hands, I think we're very aligned in that regard. What happens in a capitalist system is that you do move from organizations earning because of a margin on productive capacity to earning because they are extracting a toll for having access to that scarce, not even scarce, it doesn't even have to be scarce, it just has to be a controlled resource. And so I do think that that is one of the core problems that has to be solved, and we agree in that regard.
I'll make a final comment, which is I'm not sure that the question of who owns, who controls, how the control is exercised over the productive capacity is really the important question. I think governments will be able to step in and do whatever is needed to be done. And my evidence for that, David isn't entirely persuaded by this, but my evidence is that when Musk had a fight with Trump, having carried out some of Trump's fairly evil dictates and shut down USAID, which is probably going to kill 14 million people or so, after he'd finished doing that and he fell out with Trump, he lost that war. The world's richest man, one of the world's cleverest men, a man who'd done incredibly wonderful things as Musk 1.0, lost the battle with Trump decisively, no question. So I think when the economic singularity hits, it will be in the gift of civilian appointed governments, whatever they are, to take control of the productive assets. What I don't think we have a plan for is how we distribute the resources that those assets will be creating. As you say in your paper, those assets will be creating splendid amounts of wealth, splendid amounts of resources. We just need to figure out how to distribute it. And it might be that governments take a 99% share of GDP. It might be governments do all the spending, including distributing things to civilians, or it might be some other solution. Who knows? Again, David doesn't quite believe this idea, but I take some comfort from the amazing change in stance that governments around the world had when COVID hit. I mean, I can remember when I was going skiing and I was told, actually, you have to take your skis back because the world is shutting down now. And in that weekend, we went from a world where governments largely were hands off for most of the economy to a world where government said, right, half the economy is shutting down and we're going to give money to all the people who used to run those bits of the economy because we have to, because otherwise you'll starve. So I take some hope from the fact that we managed to do that on a turn of a dime, that we might be able to figure out a solution to the economic singularity in real time if we haven't planned it properly. But it's a risky approach, and it'd be much better if we prepared some plans in advance. So I really hope that you do produce a sequel to your paper and you answer that question, Ted. We need smart people like you to answer the question.
Well, I appreciate that. I'd like to make one comment in response, which hopefully will bring you closer to David. If we take the statement that Elon Musk demonstrably lost, we would have to then say, what does losing really mean after all? SpaceX still has enormous contracts with the US government. When a CEO falls into disfavor in China, you don't hear from them again. Elon Musk is still growing in wealth and power. And I think the interesting question is not what is the relative power between a $1 trillion wealth individual and a $40 trillion GDP nation, but rather what happens when you actually change that dynamic where you actually have the individual with greater wealth than the nation? What happens when the nation actually is beholden to the productive output of some individual's control? And if you start looking at the decisions that Musk is making right now, for example, putting compute into orbit outside sovereign control, building robots, which are a kind of protection force so that you don't disappear. Do you have a scenario in which when you have three people that own the entire global economy, that actually the nation states are beholden to those three people and not the other way around?
I think that is a very fair question. I just want to return to the Musk thing. Musk had to back down. He had to kowtow. He had to stop talking about the deficit, and he had to stop talking about Epstein. He had to give in on those points. Once he gave in on those points, he could keep his contracts with the US government, and Trump kept him happy. But you're quite right. We may end up in a new world where the power of the people owning the LLM companies is so great that no longer can governments win. I take that point as a possibility. I'm a bit skeptical, but I take the possibility. You're right.
Well, the other complication is that the AIs at that stage may be so good at manipulating people that the politicians may think they're making independent decisions, but they're being carefully guided to decisions that back up what the big tech leaders would want. That's my argument, that we've got to solve things well before we get to that stage. It's a bit like controlling AI superintelligence. I don't think we can control AI superintelligence, so we've got to control AI before it gets to that stage. Likewise, we can control the big tech leaders today, but I don't think we'll be able to control them if they get much more powerful, which is why we have to have these conversations now.
Is this when we get to talk about transhumanism and Ray Kurzweil?
That's going to have to be in the next episode. We've used up the time.
Well, I don't think the solution is going to be to merge man and machine, because I think the machines will be much cleverer without humans than one that's being slowed down by a biological brain attached to it.
I thought you were more optimistic than that, David. They would like us to join them, and then we will be massively amplified by joining them. But this is the next episode. This is not this episode.
I just want to thank you, Ted, for sharing these ideas, for thinking about things that far too few people are thinking about. I want to encourage people to engage with your ideas, not just what we've talked about today, but you have a stream of fascinating content on LinkedIn about all kinds of things, collaborative intelligence and so on, how AI is going to change organizations, not just by making individuals cleverer, but by bringing a different kind of organizational understanding to the organization. So I encourage people to look that out. And I hope we'll bring you back at some stage to discuss where your research takes you next.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Colin.
Thanks very much for joining us, Ted.